So in this video, we're about to understand what gastrulation is. And the first thing that should come to our heads is that gastrulation is an embryological process that essentially will end up with three germ layers. And we start off with the blastocyte. So the blastocyte will essentially find the endometrium, is going to get into the endometrium, physically get into the endometrium inside the uterus, and there's going to be some development stages that's going to that's going to cause the formation of our three germ layers. And these three germ layers are the ectoderm, the mesoderm, the endoderm. And these three layers are essentially are responsible for the development of specific structures, organs, and systems. And what that really essentially means is that if I were to say, okay, the heart, for example, if I were to go as back as I can and say, what part of this embryonic stage is, the heart coming from, then we could say that it's going to be the mesoderm, and the mesoderm is one of the layers. So the point is, everything in our bodies, if we were to talk about the bodies, are related to these three different germ layers. So let's get into this. There are three different layers. We talked about the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. So let's start off with the ectoderm. So the ectoderm is essentially going to be responsible for the development of the integumentary system, which is the epidermis, nails, and hair. So the development of all these things that I'm about to mention are associated with the ectoderm. So the ectoderm is going to be responsible for the integumentary system, like I said, the enamel, which is the shiny part of our teeth, the adrenal medulla, which obviously secretes epinephrine, norepinephrine, and these are important neurotransmitters and hormones. And the list goes on. So the central nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. Sensory parts of the ear, eyes, and nose, the epidermis, like we just mentioned right now, and the mammary and sweat glands, pigmentation of cells, enamel of teeth, adrenal medulla. So these are the things that are associated with the ectoderm. So now let's go on and understand the mesoderm. And I would highly suggest that you pause the video and you go through these key points yourself and understand. And if you had to write down, I would recommend just do that. So the mesoderm is essentially responsible for the production of everything, the development, better to say, of everything between the skin and the digestive epithelium. So you might be asking, what are we talking about here? And to get more specific, we're talking about the bones and the skeleton, the muscles, smooth muscles, and we're talking about the cardiovascular system. And more specifically, like we mentioned earlier, cardiovascular system in the sense that it's associated with the heart and the blood vessels, the development of the heart and the blood vessels. And also the gonads. And now the gonads are sex organs. So if we're talking about the females, it's the ovaries. If we talk about the males, it's the testes. And we also have the adrenal cortex, the spleen, and the notochord. The notochord is particularly important to understand because one of the most earliest organogenesis, which is the production of organs, is the development of the nervous system. And the notochord is essentially inducing the formation of the spinal cord and the nervous system, but it's not essentially developing into it. That's a big difference. So what needs to be understood is that the mesoderm, or the notochord, is part of the mesoderm, and it's only inducing the ectoderm to develop into the nervous system. And we'll talk about that just later on. Don't worry about it yet. The next thing we have to understand is that the endoderm that's the last layer as well that we're talking about. The endoderm is a layer that's responsible for the formation of epithelial cells, and that's associated with the lining of the digestive, respiratory, and excretory system. The stomach, liver, pancreas, lungs, bladder, all this stuff is written down. You can see it. And the thyroid, the parathyroid, and the thymus. So the key thing to take away from this is that obviously pause this, write this down, understand what each layer is associated with in terms of its development. What needs to be understood is that everything in our bodies can be traced back to one of these layers. Now the next question is, how exactly is gastrulation occurring? Now let's go back to the first processes. Let's just boil down into how this works. So remember we talked about the blastocyte. Now the blastocyte is, this is right there. So the blastocyte right over here is attaching itself to the endometrium. This is the first step of how gastrulation occurs. And at the moment we have a blastocyte. So Now let's get into the chemical aspect, what's happening on a molecular scale. So the first thing that happens is the implantation of the blastocyte. It's going to implant itself on the endometrium, like we established right over here. The next thing that's going to happen is we have the blastocyte, which is essentially going to, so let's break down the blastocyte. So blastocyte is made up of the trophoblast, and it's made up of inner cell mass, as we can see right over here, and it's associated and also has these inner cavities. So the inner cavity is for nutrition, and that's the blastocoel right over here. So the key takeaway that I want to mention here is that the trophoblast is associated with the production of the placenta eventually. And the inner cell mass is associated with the formation of germ cells. Now, take a minute here and think about it. If there's anything that's not associated with these three germ cells, or excuse me, germ layers, is the production of the placenta, meaning that as you'll see, as this blastocyte develops further on, the trophoblast is responsible for the placenta. It's not any of the three germ layers. That's a big thing to realize over here. So the next thing that happens is we have the blastocyte is going to enter the endometrium. It's physically entering it. So for it to physically enter, it obviously has to penetrate through. And how that happens essentially is through the trophoblast. The trophoblast is going to secrete enzymes that are going to help, that's going to allow the blastocyte to get into the endometrium. So the next step we have over here is the inner cell mass is going to further develop into two different types. So we have the hypoblast and the epiblast. And just know that the hypoblast is essentially going to develop into the endoderm, and the epiblast is going to develop into the ectoderm. So you might be asking yourself, hang on, we have another layer we talked about, the mesoderm. What's happening to the mesoderm? The mesoderm is essentially going to be formed through the invagination of the ectoderm. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. Don't worry about it. So the next step that happens is the upper portion of the hypoblast and the epiblast will migrate up to form this new structure right here. And this is the umbilical vessel that we see right over here, and the amniotic cavity right over here. And the amniotic cavity is where the fetus itself will be actually found. So let's just keep that in our heads. Now, here's the next step that's really, really interesting, I think, is the formation of the mesoderm. Now, the mesoderm over here is essentially going to be formed through something we call the primitive streak. And the primitive streak essentially is just in the invagination of the ectoderm. So the ectoderm right over here, as you can see, and now watch my hand motion, the ectoderm is basically invaginated. And what that means essentially is that if this were the ectoderm layer, it's pushing out in this motion. As it pushes out, it's forming the mesoderm instead. And that's super cool, I think. And eventually this allows the formation. The invagination is going to, invagination along the primitive streak is going to allow this new structure to form. So notice how we have these cells all over, it's engulfed around the umbilical vessel and also the amniotic cavity. So the next thing that happens is we have the umbilical vessel that's going to push into the amniotic cavity. And this right here is the formation of our developing embryos. This right over here is a developing embryo. And we can now distinctly see the three different layers as well. So here's the mesoderm that we see, here is the ectoderm that we see, and here is the endoderm that we see. And also notice how we have the placenta formed. That's pretty cool, isn't it? So this is the essential goal of gastrulation. We have gone from a blastocyte that was not mature, a blastocyte. We've gone from a blastocyte to this. It's more developed now. Another thing that we want to mention real fast is the different kinds of gastrulations we can have. We have two kinds that are possible, depending on the cleavage. So the first is, it could be asymmetrical, and that means it's a spiral cleavage, and it has 8 cells. This is going to essentially, as the colon splits, it's going to split from the mesoderm. Just remember that. So notice how the colon is not part of the mesoderm; it's kind of separated, and this will eventually cause as the protosome, or as the formation proceeds, we're going to see that the blastopore, the first thing that develops is the mouth. So the blastopore goes to the mouth. That is a protosome. Whereas if we were to think about the other scenario, which is we have a radial cleavage, that means that we have a plane of symmetry. Now we see that the column is associated with the mesoderm, and that's kind of interesting if you see. So in this case scenario, we're going to say that the blastopore is firstly going to develop into the anus. So this is a detrosome. So a detrosome is firstly going to form its anus and then its mouth, whereas the protosome is going to develop its mouth first from the blastopore, and then the anus. So that's the two differences that we should understand. And just remember that the word itself, proto, is kind of indicating before. And just that's how you understand that protosome is just saying that the first thing that happens, obviously, is we have the mouth develop. So we have now understood what gastrulation is, the two different types that are possible, the protosomes, the detrosomes, and we have also understood the essential purpose of gastrulation, which is the formation of the three layers: the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. And also, please, like I said before, pause this video, make sure that you understand each one of these points. Thank you.